Good afternoon, and thanks for coming to the Concord Bookshop today. I'm so happy to introduce Thomas Oliphant and Curtis Wilkie, authors of the new book, The Road to Camelot, Inside JFK's 5-Year Campaign, which is this book. Lovely. Mr. Oliphant is a Pulitzer Prize-winning former journalist for the Boston Globe, and has also written the book, Utter Incompetence, Ego and Ideology in the Age of Bush, among other titles. Mr. Wilkie was a national reporter and correspondent for the Boston Globe, and is currently a professor of journalism at the University of Mississippi. His published books include The Fall of the House of Zeus, The Rise and Ruin of America's Most Powerful Trial Lawyer. I have read too many glowing reviews of The Road to Camelot to list, but let's just say it's already been admired by historians, journalists, and even President Obama's 2008 campaign manager, who reviewed it for the Washington Post. While JFK is a popular subject among biographers and presidential historians, our authors take a fresh look at just how early he began to work towards his goal, as well as the degree of influence the Kennedy family had on his success. John F. Kennedy shaped a campaign based on person-to-person connections, rather than focusing solely on party bosses, and in doing so, he changed the future of campaigning for both parties. The Road to Camelot challenges some of our preconceived notions and brings Kennedy's tireless campaign to life. I hope you all enjoy learning more about the road to one of America's most memorable presidencies. We have copies for the book on sale at the front desk, and there'll be time to get books signed after the authors have taken questions from the audience. But please pay for your book before you have it signed. So now, please help me welcome Mr. Thomas Oliphant and Curtis Wilkie to talk about the Road to Camelot.
Jesus, you did a better job summing that up than we did.
Thanks.
Took us about 150,000 more words than that. First of all, it's great to be in this amazing store. I haven't been in for a while. I think with Doris Kearns Goodwin was the last time I was here, and it had something to do with baseball. You all know her as the one-time candidate for president of Red Sox Nation. I know her as a great Catholic girl who shared my love for the Brooklyn Dodgers a long time ago. You too?
Yeah.
You from Brooklyn?
Well, Dolph Camilli.
Yep.
Dolph Camilli, that's even before Campanella. There, Pete Reeser. Ran into a few walls in his time.
Yeah.
Doris and I have long agreed that the happiest day of our lives was October the 4th, 1955, when they finally beat the New York Yankees, and just once were the world champions. And ironically, 1955 is when Curtis and I start our tale. I want to just introduce a few concepts, and Curtis is going to introduce a couple more, but please interrupt for any reason. If you want to talk about the Dodgers, fine. Fine. We wanted to see a couple of years ago if a lot of the myths, assumptions about the path that John Kennedy took to the White House were true. Being contrarians at heart, we had a lot of fun researching and discovering that most of them aren't true. And it convinced us that after 60 years, maybe it's time for historians and other writers to take a fresh look at this. It was a pivotal candidacy at a pivotal time. It had results substantively that are still with us today. I always like to say I didn't pay much attention to it as a kid in 1960, but it sure matters that John Kennedy thought up Medicare. And that's just the tip of an enormous substantive iceberg that he contributed to. But the most important thing that we realized was that this story is not the year or 15-month saga that presidential campaigns like the 10 or 11 we did together are portrayed as. This wasn't that kind of thing at all. It was a 5-year effort with the specific goal of national office in Kennedy's mind. The vice presidency for the first 7 or 8 months, the presidency explicitly thereafter. No one at the time he started running, and he made the decision after Thanksgiving dinner on the Cape in 1956 and started running flat out in 1957, we discovered. No one had ever done this before. He was the first national figure to attempt to reach the presidency from the outside in, not from the inside out. Nobody really had heard of him beyond his celebrity and war record. He hadn't really done anything. There's not much evidence that he thought much of it about any of the great questions of the day. And so his rise, you think the Dodgers were an upset in 1955. This guy made no sense as a national figure when he started running for president, and he did it because he could. One of the other myths down through the years that we enjoyed confronting was that he was sort of a celebrity dilettante under the thumb of his enormously wealthy father. And it intrigued us to discover as we researched that while he actually loved his father a great deal, as many sons do, he almost never paid attention to his advice. His father could be loud and overbearing and certain and dogmatic, blah, 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 blah. But John and Robert Kennedy almost never listened to him about politics. And for a reason, before I hand this to Curtis. There was a very different conception of national leadership and how you obtain it that separated father and son, as it did people of John Kennedy's generation and those who had come before. Joseph P. Kennedy was very much a creature of the teens, 20s, and 30s, when national politics and presidential leadership came as a result of arrangements you made with people who also had political power. Nominations for the presidency were essentially brokered all the way through the 50s, certainly through the 40s, but mostly through the 50s as well. Kennedy's only route, he realized very early, would be to involve these people who had not had much to do with presidential politics until that time. They're called voters. And for a alleged patrician or elitist or rich guy, his path to the presidency essentially was created through mechanisms that involve voters. To an extent in what we call primaries, to an extent by means of the very first pollster that had ever been hired in a presidential campaign, a young guy named Lou Harris, who went on to great fame and wealth. But his rookie experience was working with Kennedy. His father, as I said, had the exact opposite point of view, and I wanted to, before I give this to Curtis, there's a quote that sometimes is used by historians from Joseph P. Kennedy about how his son might make it to the White House. And it was something that Joe Kennedy said in 1952 when it first became apparent that he had a more than good chance of unseating Henry Cabot Lodge and winning election to the United States Senate. And the old man was getting kind of excited at the prospect. And with a couple of his old cronies, he said one evening, you know, Jack he's going to win this thing. He's going to get elected senator. And then I'm going to take him and I'm going to get him elected president. And I know how to do it. There are 20 people in this country who control this process, and I know almost all of them, and I can get to them, and I can make deals with him, and when I'm done, the kid's going to be president. Well, what Joe Kennedy said was out of date when he said it in 1952. It wasn't even a bad joke in 1956, and it had absolutely nothing to do with how presidents were being selected by 1960, and his son realized it. And it set him on a course punctuated by the first pollster, the first use of, God forbid, 30-second television commercials. The list is this long of things that he and his young band of rookies developed in order to have a chance to lead the country. And they came out of nowhere to do it. And nobody, when they started, it's not so much nobody thought they would do it. People were amazed that he was even trying. Right, Curtis?
Right. Right.
Ooh.
We're very informal. We're great old pals. We've been dear friends for more than 40 years. And we worked for the Boston Globe together for a number of years, close to 3 decades. I was amused in the current New Yorker when there was a nice mention of us in Thomas Mallon's long essay on Kennedy, and we were described as Boston sentimentalist. And Tom is a child of Lower East Side and graduated from high school in La Jolla in California, and you can tell from my accent that I'm not from Southie, but actually from Mississippi.
If you have any trouble,
But one of there were a couple of things that came together as we developed the idea for this book. One is that as a child in Mississippi, I watched the 1956 Democratic Convention on TV, very snowy TV at that. But I was fascinated by this attempt by John Kennedy to get on the ticket with Adlai Stevenson. Some of you will have hair the same color as mine. You may remember that when Adlai Stevenson was getting the nomination, and rather than choosing his running mate, Stevenson was famously indecisive. He threw it to the convention to choose his running mate. And so a number of people jumped into it, including this young, untested senator. It's really the first time I knew anything about John Kennedy, and it's the first time basically people in this country outside of Massachusetts knew much about John Kennedy. And it was a great battle. It's the last time that a convention has gone past the first ballot. We haven't had a second ballot since then. And it involved a fight between Kennedy and Estes Kefauver from Tennessee, who ultimately won, Hubert Humphrey, Bob Wagner, who was the mayor of New York, and old Senator Gore from Tennessee were the combatants. It was incredibly exciting. As a 15-year-old kid, I'm watching this, and for years I wanted to, once I began writing books, I wanted to write a book about this afternoon and about the players that were involved in the drama. And I, with my agent, cobbled together a proposal. No publisher was interested in it. Finally, through a friend, I got an audience with Alice Mayhew, who's one of the most famous political editors at any publishing house at Simon & Schuster, and pitched the story to her. 2003, she listened to me for a while, then she looked at me very hard look, said, "Not big enough." So I got very discouraged. That was the end of that. I had done a lot of research. I had talked to a number of people who are no longer living who were with Kennedy back then, and other people. Fast forward about 12 years, and Tom and his wife Susan are down in Oxford visiting us, and we're talking. And Tom talks about how, in the meantime, he's been having conversations with Ted Sorensen, who was still living at the time, and how Sorensen had lamented that nobody had ever written a book about this long campaign that they went through from, as Tom says, from actually 55, 56. And so we said it was kind of a eureka moment. And so Tom and I went out to my office on the campus at Ole Miss, and I dug through, found all my notes, my research from 12 years before. So we cobbled together this joint proposal. Publishers liked it. We had an auction for the book, and guess who wanted the book in the end? Alice Mayhew from Simon and Schuster. So we got very lucky having a home with her. Just for a Massachusetts audience, it's a national book. It's not parochial at all, but there's one chapter that I enjoyed, and Tom got a kick out too, because I covered a little bit of Boston politics in the 70s, and then I was gone for a while, and then was back in Boston with the Globe in the 90s. But I guess 75 was a great introduction for me, and crazy Irish tribal politics in Boston that I covered the Kevin White, Joe Timothy race in 75. Great introduction for a kid from Mississippi to Boston politics. And there's a wonderful moment that I think largely is chapter 3 in the book. Kennedy is already interested in beginning to be a national figure. This is in the spring of 56, before the convention. And he is convinced by people like Kenny O'Donnell and Dave Powers, part of the old Irish Mafia, said, Jack, if you really want to be a player in Massachusetts, you got to take control of the state party. The state party is now controlled by John McCormick, who was at that time the House Majority Leader, who later became the Speaker. And McCormick had an ally, a guy named Onions Burke, was somewhere out in Western Mass, I forget. He was a saloon keeper, and he also grew onions on the side, and so hence his name, Onions Burke. So, and so we researched this diligently, and there's some great accounts in contemporary newspapers that we looked at, and we pieced together this chapter of O'Donnell and Powers in their book, Johnny, We Hardly Knew You. They have a nice account, but we like to think we expanded on it. It was really an instance of Kennedy playing hardball. He decides, okay, I'll do this. It's another example of Joe Kennedy says, don't dare do this. Don't get involved in this quagmire that is Boston politics. They're all a bunch of Irish hacks, and you don't want to get involved in it. So instead of taking his advice, Kennedy plunges in. He challenges Onions Burke, and the battle is set. And as most of you know, if you've lived here, that the Kennedys and McCormicks never got along. McCormick was South Boston, and they hated the Kennedys and vice versa. So Kennedy's going to take on Onions Burke with his own candidate. And he thought at first he was going to run Dick Donahue, also part of the Irish Mafia, but Dick Donahue had gone to Dartmouth, and they felt that he might not be acceptable to the 60-something member state committee. So they finally, O'Donnell came up with a guy named Paddy Lynch, and he sold him. Kennedy didn't even know him. He says, we got the perfect candidate. He's a great guy. He went to Holy Cross, played football there. So Kennedy says, sounds ideal. So he's going to anoint Paddy Lynch to take on Onions Burke. And O'Donnell brings Paddy Lynch in to see him, and Kennedy is aghast. Paddy Lynch is about this tall. He's bald, and says, Jesus, instead of bringing me a candidate, he brought me a leprechaun. But anyway, the two sides go to battle at the old Hotel Bradford in Boston, and we called it an Irish tongue war. Everybody mentioned in this chapter, and there are about 40 different names that show up. They're all Irish, and they get in fist fights at the convention, shoving each other, cursing, carrying on. The Kennedys installed 2 off-duty policemen to block all of McCormick's people from even getting in the room. And anyway, they breached that. They knocked the guards down. They get into the room. Kennedy people thought, well, we'll restore order. They called the police commissioner, a guy named Sullivan. And he shows up. It turns out he likes McCormick. So he threatens to throw Larry O'Brien in jail for obstructing the convention. Total wild, funny scene. So it's just a reminder to me of a Mississippi kid of how much fun Massachusetts politics could be. And it kind of takes off from there to the 56th convention and goes on and on. So the book is, I think, is rich with anecdote. Those we went through, and we wanted to tell a story, a fresh story that you all, hopefully that you might know some of it, but certainly not all of it. And Tom he's a Harvard guy, so he's more articulate in this, but you can talk about what a rich place, a rich source is the Kennedy Library. That we spent time going through all the oral history. Some of them are available online, some of them in Oxford, Mississippi. I was able to get through the interlibrary loan system, but we spent time going through so many of them at the Kennedy Library here, and it's incredible the stories that are in those oral histories from people, many of them we'd never heard of before, but it turns out they had instrumental roles in this long campaign. Tom, your turn.
Just a last sentence before we call for questions, comments, and whatever.
How do you work together? I mean, who writes what, and who does it? It's a
Good question.
In our acknowledgments, we had a sentence that reads something like, we especially want to thank the 21st century. Each of us in our crazy lives has been around this track before. And the drill always was our offices looked like the town dump. There'd be stacks of papers all around the office, filed, God knows what system we used and whatever. Tailor-made for working by yourself, maybe, but not in concert with somebody else. This technology changes everything. You can literally watch each other taking notes. The places where you put your notes are accessible to both of you.
Yeah, we use something I never heard of called a Dropbox. And so we both are sending our research into this Dropbox that I'd never heard of. Tom figured it out.
And then there was you start writing, and it's like your friend is standing over your shoulder. And you're batting drafts back and forth in ways that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. And so it's changed the nature of collaboration. And for the first time, I'm beginning to think you really do double the scope, particularly of a nonfiction work, when you have a couple of people working on it. So that's the answer.
We also, for example, before we got started, we went back and either reread books that we had read, or we read some new ones. We came up with a list of maybe 40 or 50 books we thought were applicable. We divided them. Tom took all the ones with the authors, went from A to M, and I took N to Z.
Very
did the same
sophisticated system.
Did the same thing with the oral histories. He took A through M, and I took N through Z. So that, and the other thing is, we wrote together under double bylines for the Globe, mostly, if I recall, in the 80 and the 84 campaigns. Then Tom became a exalted columnist, and I went off overseas. But we're not only old friends, but we had written together before. We're pretty compatible in our politics and our thinking, in our misbehavior and things like that.
To give a little sense of what research is, I mean, on this subject, you know, there's material in California, as you might guess, Texas, certainly, New York. Until we started a couple of years ago, I didn't realize that Stevenson's political papers are stored at Columbia. I had no idea that was the case. And then there's here. In the library are 25 million pieces of paper. Now, some of them, you know, have such insights as, you know, there's going to be cookies and coffee in the conference room at 3 p.m. sort of stuff. But a lot of it is fresh. And the oral histories, which the Kennedys pioneered after the president was murdered, there are more than 1,600 of them. And what Curtis and I kept discovering was that hardly any of this stuff had been comprehensively examined. Our conclusion is that for 60 years, Kennedy's been too easy. You can get, in the writing world, even academic world, you can get away with stuff that would never pass muster if you were writing a biography, say, of Millard Fillmore, which I don't recommend. But it's clear that there's an enormous iceberg of material yet to be studied. History is not some fixed point in the sky, as I'm sure you know. It's a process. It's a pendulum that's always moving. And certainly hope that now that he's turning 100 this week, that there'll be some fresh eyes that are going to go into this area in much more depth than people have so far. Ma'am,
I read about
what part of Brooklyn are you from?
Coney Island.
Coney Island.
Closer to Brighton Beach before the Russians.
Wow. I've been swimming in Brooklyn.
It's been a while since I did. But I read a biography of Joe Kennedy Jr., and he just, everything the old man thought, he did the same. Whereas John Kennedy was totally the opposite. The old man was a bigot, he wasn't. And
I'm a little wary of some of the generalizations.
well,
We didn't study the old man.
well, he was.
There's a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, I don't know where the isolationism came from.
I know where the anti-Semitism came from.
Well, yeah, it was deeply ingrained in our culture. Still is, in a way.
Still is.
But at the same time, he was also a father trying to advance the careers of sons who had diametrically opposed viewpoints. If you like complicated families, you ought to try that one, right?
Yeah, he was, talking about anti-Semitism, he was also, old Joe Kennedy, his father was influenced by all the bigotry toward the Irish. He moved his family out of Boston, out of actually Brookline, moved down to Westchester County, New York.
I worked as a librarian in Dorchester. Some of them, the attitudes of the Irish, they questioned it. They didn't believe it. Now, I said, yeah, just look it up.
You know, that chip on the shoulder, which is one of the sad consequences of bigotry, didn't go away quickly.
No.
The evidence we kept bumping into was that it was very much a part of John Kennedy's life. And I experienced it personally with his brothers. You know, you scratch them a little bit, and the resentment and the anger at the way their parents' generation had been very real.
No, I was in college. I was a junior in college in 1960. And I had forgotten how Catholicism was probably the single biggest issue in this campaign.
Mm-hmm.
Totally forgotten it, because once that campaign was over and once Kennedy won, it disappeared as an issue in America. But it was by far the biggest thing that John Kennedy had to overcome. And he had a lot of powerful people who were exploiting it. You know, there was at one point we discovered in our research that there was a literally there was a conspiracy between the Nixon campaign, Billy Graham, a guy named Daniel Polling, and the power of positive thinking. Norman Vincent Peale. Thank you. You remember. These guys all got together, and they're trying to do everything they can to prevent the election of a Catholic as president. They had secret meetings. Billy Graham is writing Dear Dick letters to Nixon. Nixon's writing back Dear Billy, and you know they're having these secret conferences, doing everything they can to undermine.
Anybody remember what Adlai Stevenson said about Norman Vincent Peale? You get $1. Adlai Stevenson said that in the area of theology, he found Paul appealing. And Peale appalling. They really did this. You know, maybe an ancillary discovery of ours. It goes with the fact that here was this young kid being hired as the first guy to take polls for a presidential campaign full time. Lou Harris, barely 30 years old. And as we looked at some of Mr. Harris's research from early on, late 1957, early 1958, it was clear to us that the numbers told Harris this was a two-edged sword, not just simply a handicap. That, yeah, there was a problem with bigotry, and maybe 10% of the electorate wouldn't vote for Kennedy under any circumstances because he was Catholic. At the same time, however, they found a lot of people, generally not particularly partisan, some of them Republican, particularly who lived in these strange new places, at least as of 1960. I think they were called suburbs. And these Catholics were more than happy to come out for John Kennedy because it would be advancing one of their own. It'd be one more step in the road to assimilation. But the amount of material we dealt with having to do with a subject that died the day after the election astonished us.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I guess you presented it as really radical, the way he ran for president. And it seems kind of obvious looking back. He ran for Congress. He, had a congressional campaign. He ran statewide, kind of enlisted the family, did things that way. It makes sense that it was just kind of a logical progression of what they had been doing.
Oh, absolutely. The 46 congressional campaign was kind of the beginning of it all because he had a kind of a mantra to start early. And in 46, I forget how many people were running for that seat. 11 people running in the Democratic primary. And Kennedy got out in front ahead of anybody. He built grassroots organizations in various neighborhoods back then in that district. It would certainly extend to the townships when he ran state. He went out and he developed outside of the party structure. He always, and in 60 did the same thing. He started early. LBJ, he thought he could sit back and win the thing at the convention because he had all the powerful people in the party behind him, he thought. Kennedy totally had outflanked him. Humphrey was his opponent in the primaries, but Kennedy outflanked him, going in and organizing in these selected primaries. Lou Harris helped guide him which primaries he would tackle. Went in, won every one of them. He got the momentum. By the time they went to L.A. for the convention, they had their own, again, just like the little committees in 46, they had Kennedy committees all over the country that were not operating with state party at all, but in his interest only. So no question that he employed so many of the same devices in 60 that he did in 46. And they were the kind of things, as Tom said at the outset, presidential candidates didn't think of. They all relied on bosses to deliver big blocks of delegates at the convention. He blew that up.
So as a follow-up to your question, did that change the tenor of the 64 presidential campaign? Did you see various candidates following more the roadmap that Kennedy had set?
Goldwater in 64 did the same thing. I mean, both parties. Classic, not everybody won, but Gene McCarthy in 68. Tom and I covered McGovern in 72. That was classic. Jimmy Carter in 76. Classic guy coming from the outside in defiance of the party. Yeah, no question. He was the first. Nobody had ever done. Kefauver tried to do it a little bit through primaries in 52 and 56 and never got anywhere. But Kennedy was the guy that really first did it.
And then there was this guy named Trump. But it's the same thing.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Tom, you started out by saying that your goal was to examine the myths and that you found most of the myths untrue. Could each of you comment perhaps on one and elaborate on it that you either found unusual, ironic, unexpected?
Well, Tom just whispered debates. Absolutely. I think that people thought that the debates were decisive, that they really changed the momentum for Kennedy, particularly after the first one. As Tom likes to say, Nixon showed up looking like he'd been living under a bridge for about a week, and Kennedy was polished and tan, and he had on a blue shirt and that sort of thing. But Lou Harris would poll after each of the 4 debates, and the needle never changed between. It was a very, very close election. You guys would remember. It was one that we didn't know how it came out to really dawn the next day. But it was that close throughout. There was never a empirical evidence that public opinion had shifted to Kennedy because of his performance in either the first debate, where he, everybody remembers him winning, to the last debate.
Well,
they didn't make any difference.
How do you think that was promulgated by his PR people? That it was decisive, or
it's after the election. That's when most of the misconceptions we think about all this began, and maybe after the president was murdered. But it wasn't while it was going on. One of the things that was much different about 1960 than now, and our careers sort of began when this was still the case also, there was a lot more information in political stories back then. People you actually covered what the candidates said, and you could sort of follow what that kind of thing. Instead of this, to do a caricature of a political story today, you'd have a half a quote from some clown, and then you'd have what the polling by left-handed Lithuanians shows, and who thinks it's going to help somebody win or lose, and you never learn anything about what a candidate's saying, whether it makes any sense, whatever. So that's how it gets. That's how it gets started. Let me give you another one. Because of the victory in the Electoral College, boy, the choice of Lyndon Johnson was the easiest pick ever. Slam dunk, right? Somebody who brings all that. What we found. Our basic conclusion was that President Kennedy bungled into the selection of Lyndon Johnson. That he had falsely assumed for months, he and his brother both, that Johnson would never say yes. was flabbergasted the morning after the nomination when he realized that Johnson was lusting for the job. And as a result, JFK and his brother closed the door to their hotel suite for a couple of hours and had what Bob Kennedy later described as the most indecisive period of the entire campaign, batting this thing back and forth, and decided they didn't want him. And the issue was trust. But JFK had a condition, we discovered. Johnson's too powerful. He's interested now. You got to find something that's going to make him happy if it's not going to be the vice presidential nomination. And I'm still looking for the quote. Maybe I'll find it in a second. But Bob Kennedy had that job, and they couldn't come up with something. Johnson was so desperate to get on that ticket, nothing would make him happy. And so, even though they didn't want to and had decided not to, they were going to pick Stuart Symington of Missouri. They went back to Johnson, and they had to do it. And what Bob Kennedy said later is, we decided that we would try to get rid of him, and it just didn't work.
One quote.
And the consequences, I'm sorry, the consequences of that are gigantic, if you think about it. In places like Vietnam, Dallas, and in Bob Kennedy's case, Los Angeles. All in a couple of crazy hours that turn out to be quite different than the way they're normally portrayed.
One quote I remember from those exchanges, Bobby Kennedy goes down, he offers LBJ chairmanship of the Democratic Party. Well, the Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn, fellow Texan, is there with Johnson in this meeting, and he had one word, quote, "Forgive me on a Sunday afternoon." Sam Rayburn looked at Bobby Kennedy and said, "Shit." Rejected it. One other thing, briefly, in terms of myth, John Kennedy's generally perceived as being strong on civil rights. He was a very latecomer on that. He played footsie with the worst kind of racists in the South from 56 on, because he first got the idea that he would be marketable in the South because so many of the Southern delegations supported him in his final battle for vice presidential nomination against Estes Kefauver, who, even though he's from Tennessee, was hated by all the Southerners because he had refused to sign the Southern Manifesto and was considered far too liberal. So Kennedy left Chicago, and he said to Arthur Kroc, said, "I'll be whistling Dixie the rest of my life." He courted these people. He was down, we found incredible letters between John Kennedy and George Wallace. Kennedy's offering Wallace any help he can get in the gubernatorial election and whatever. And he consorted with most dreadful kind of people. And I'm a Southerner, but people like Jim Eastland is an unspeakable racist, and he thought that they were allies. He supported them, and he antagonized along the way some of the civil rights leadership. Most remarkably, Roy Wilkins, who was head of the NAACP, and they had some very serious differences, and it was only well into the 60 campaign that Kennedy began to realize that he couldn't abandon the African American vote in the North. Back then, to remember, blacks couldn't vote in the South. And so he was basically catering, and the South was essential to his coalition. So he had to appeal to the old Confederate states and at the same time try not to risk losing states like New York and Pennsylvania and Illinois and Ohio, Michigan all had substantial numbers of black votes, black people who voted. So he walked a real tightrope. through that whole thing, but he was not an ardent supporter of civil rights.
You know, there's a great story connected to this, and I'm going to encourage Curtis to keep going and tell part of it, because looking at the numbers, we more or less concluded that an episode in late October probably tipped the election at the last minute.
Yeah, that was when Martin Luther King was arrested in Atlanta, and a judge sentenced him to 4 months hard labor, and then they spirited him away to a notorious prison in South Georgia. And so his wife, Coretta, became very distressed. She had all these nightmares all along that he would someday be murdered because of his mission. And she appealed for help. They appealed to both of the presidential candidates, Nixon and Kennedy. Nixon did nothing. The Kennedy people didn't want to do anything either because they felt it was too volatile a case to get involved in. Mrs. King appealed to a guy named Harris Wofford, who ran the civil rights office for Kennedy. Or actually, he ran it. He didn't have the title running. It was a white guy, later became a U.S. senator. And Wofford was committed. He felt it was something Kennedy should do. Kennedy needed to do something. He knew he was going to have to run past this Irish Praetorian Guard around the candidate. You know, Kenny O'Donnell and Salinger, of course, was not, but Sorensen, Salinger, Kenny O'Donnell, O'Brien, they all thought it was a terrible idea. Bobby Kennedy thought it was a terrible idea. So Wofford finally thinks, who can I call? He called Sarge Shriver in Chicago, the brother-in-law, and who'd been very active in civil rights in Chicago. So Sarge Shriver agrees. So he waits until all these guys around Kennedy who opposed it are out of the room. Kennedy's at a hotel room at O'Hare Airport. And he says, Jack, I really think you need to call Coretta King. It would comfort her. And Jack Kennedy said, sure, I'll call her. And what's the big deal? And he dialed up her number, talked to her for about 2 minutes. And Bobby Kennedy heard about the call. Well, Kennedy mentioned it on the plane afterwards to Salinger. Salinger blew up his press secretary. Says, my God, what have you done? Calls Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy explodes. Says, we've lost the election. Bobby Kennedy calls in all the members of the Civil Rights Office and yells and screams at them. Said, you have blown the election for us. You go back to your office and don't do a damn thing the rest of this campaign because you probably have lost it for us. The next day, Bobby Kennedy goes off to New York, and this is largely from an oral history from a friend of both of ours named John Siegenthaler, who worked very closely with Bobby Kennedy, and I had interviewed John for my idea of a book, the earlier book, and Bobby Kennedy calls in from New York the next day, and John Siegenthaler says, Bobby, there was a crazy story came out of Georgia that this crazy judge said you called him and asked him if he wouldn't let Martin King out. He said, don't worry, we've already put out a denial on it. And Bobby Kennedy says, well, you're going to have to retract that because I did call him. So everybody's wondering, what in the hell has caused Bobby Kennedy to change his mind? Well, it turns out, a lot of this I had never heard. I thought I knew this story backwards and forward. But the governor of Georgia, who was another dreadful guy named Vandiver, he wants Martin King out of jail because it becomes such a mess. And he calls up Bobby Kennedy and says, look, all I want to do is to get the son of a bitch out of jail. If you'll call the judge, and there was some family connection between Vandiver and the judge, he'll let him out. So Bobby Kennedy calls the judge in Georgia, the judge releases Martin King. So at this point, all the people around Martin King rejoice. He's free. The Kennedy campaign leaps on it. They print up literally millions of copies of a little blue pamphlet that said Nixon did nothing and Jack Kennedy stepped in. He called for King. So they were distributed through all of the black churches on the Sunday before the election. They were all through Harlem. That crazy guy was with Adam Clayton Powell.
Clarence Jones.
The Fox. The Fox, one of Adam Powell's operatives in Harlem, said, "Don't worry, we got the blue bomb all over Harlem." They had black churches all over America. And it's generally not just by Oliphant and Wilkie. Dwight Eisenhower, after the fact, said he felt this was ultimately the difference in that very close race. Not the blacks in Georgia, they couldn't vote anyway, but the blacks in all of these competitive states in the North, and that's what made us in the end through the election to Jack Kennedy.
So it is a good trivia question. What state did Kennedy carry by the highest percentage other than Massachusetts? You get $1 for this.
New York? New York?
Southern state.
Southern state?
Georgia.
Georgia.
And not much below the Massachusetts numbers. Anybody know the third highest victory percentage? Louisiana.
A lot of Catholics in Louisiana, South Louisiana.
But it's a reminder that in 1960, much more of the country was in play than is the case today. You know, with targeting and everything you hear in a general election about 10 or 11 states, you know, that are really the key. 25 to 30 were in doubt right up until the end. I think the margin in 15 of them was less than a percentage point. So something like this tale is exactly what you're looking for if you're trying to understand a late shift of a point or two.
We have time for one more question.
Oh, it was just I had read something that when it was so close, and I was sitting up about 3 a.m. with my father. But somebody said that this is our time, Democrats' time, and they had to nominate a Catholic. I read that somewhere.
No.
No, but I read it. I don't remember where it was. I read it somewhere.
Here's another good one. In the middle of the night, well, actually more toward 5 in the morning, what was the state called for Kennedy that caused a consensus to form that he had been elected president and caused him to get in the car and go over to the armory in Hyannis and become President-elect Kennedy? What state tipped it? You get $1. It was Minnesota.
The Umavi Range.
He had lost Wisconsin just narrowly. Same problem, Lutherans. Theologically, I have no problem, but back then, and I come from a Scandinavian family, not quite as bad in Minnesota, and he just fell over the line in Minnesota, and that's what gave him the Electoral College majority on paper that night and caused the Secret Service to show up at dawn.
Mojave Range.
I'm sorry?
The Mojave Range, where the iron ore was, someplace in northern Minnesota.
Well, of course, Kennedy, like all Democrats, cleaned up on the Iron Range. But what won the state was that he did much better than Adlai Stevenson had among the Lutherans in the southern part below Minneapolis.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
So I'll make a little pass in the chairs to go on.